Widow. Alone on a ranch. 64 years old, men in black trucks pull up to her gate. Suits. Smiles. A legal document bearing her dead husband's signature. He's been in the ground for 3 years. She reads every word. Doesn't flinch. Hands it back. My husband wrote left-handed. They give her 30 days to leave everything she's ever loved. What they don't know, what nobody in that county knows anymore, is that her husband spent his final months building a case. Quietly, carefully, leaving evidence with people Pierce would never think to threaten. And she's about to use all of it, in front of the entire town. The square fills. The crowd goes silent. The man they sent steps forward. Big, confident, armed. Settle this right now, old woman. 1 shot each. She reaches for the Colt she hasn't touched in 3 years. She doesn't hesitate. They never asked who she was. The fence wasn't going to fix itself. Ellie Cross knew that. She'd known it since Tuesday, when the North Post finally gave out after 2 hard winters, and 1 stubborn bull that didn't understand the meaning of boundaries. She was out there by 6, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, before the coffee had finished brewing. She left it on the counter, still dripping, because the fence mattered more than the coffee, and she was 64 years old, and she had learned a long time ago that the things worth keeping required showing up before you felt ready. Harlow, Texas in October had a particular kind of morning, cool without being cold, quiet without being empty, the kind of quiet that had texture to it, the low sound of cattle settling, the creak of the barn door in the wind, the distant call of a mockingbird that had no business being that enthusiastic at this hour. Ellie worked the post with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, because she had. She and Harold had built every fence line on this property together, 412 acres, every post, every wire, every gate that swung just right. Harold used to say a fence was a promise. You put it in the ground and you were promising the land you'd take care of it. Harold had been gone 3 years now. She kept his promises anyway. The ranch looked different without him. Not worse, just quieter. The same red barn, the same gravel drive, the same view of the low hills to the west that turned gold in autumn like someone had lit them from inside. But there was a stillness to the place now that hadn't been there before. Like the land itself was holding its breath, Ellie didn't mind the quiet. She had made her peace with it somewhere in the first year, when she understood that grief wasn't something you finished. It was something you learned to carry without letting it carry you. She tasted the last post, packed the dirt firm around the base, tested it with both hands. It held. She stood up straight, pressed one hand to the small of her back the way she always did these days, and looked out across the east pasture. The grass was dry and golden. The cattle moved slow and easy in the far corner. The sky above was the pale blue of early morning, just starting to deepen. It was a good piece of land. It had always been a good piece of land. She walked back toward the house. On the porch, she passed the old wooden hook where Harold used to hang his hat. She had never moved it. She had never hung anything else there either. Inside, she poured her coffee. It was lukewarm now. She drank it anyway and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the fence she had just fixed and thought about how strange it was to love something this much. A piece of ground, a few hundred acres of Texas grass and clay and rock. But it wasn't really the land she loved. It was everything the land represented. 40 years of mornings like this one. 40 years of Harold's voice at the breakfast table, and his boots on the porch steps, and his laugh that started slow and ended up involving his whole body. She loved the land because the land remembered him. On the wall beside the window, there was a photograph. Harold and Ellie, 1987, the Harlow County Shooting Championship. They were both grinning like fools. Harold had his arm around her. They were both holding trophies. Harold's was second place. Ellie's was first. He had teased her about it for years. She had never let him forget it. She touched the edge of the frame with one finger, just briefly. Then she turned and rinsed her cup in the sink and went to start the rest of her morning. Above the kitchen door, on a wooden peg that Harold had put there in 1989, hung a leather holster. Inside it, a Colt single-action Army revolver, clean and dark with age. It hadn't been touched in 3 years. Ellie walked under it without looking up. She heard them before she saw them. That was how it always worked out here. Sound carried differently on flat land. A truck engine had nowhere to hide. She was in the barn, checking on the older mare, when she heard the crunch of gravel on the main drive. Not one vehicle, two. She walked out of the barn slowly. Two black trucks. Clean and expensive, the kind that had never seen actual ranch work. 3 men in the first one, 2 in the second. They were dressed in slacks and button-down shirts, which told her everything she needed to know about who had sent them. The man who got out first was maybe 45, dark hair, trimmed close. Smile already in place before he even looked at her. He was carrying a leather folder, holding it with both hands, like it was something important. It turned out it was, Mrs. Cross, he said. I'm Raymond Lyle. I represent Denton Pierce and Pierce Land Holdings. Ellie had heard that name. Everyone in Harlow County had heard that name. Pierce had been buying up land in this part of Texas for the better part of 5 years. Quietly at first, then less quietly. 3 ranches to the north of her had changed hands in the last 18 months. She had heard things, rumors, mostly, that the sellers hadn't been entirely willing, that the prices paid hadn't been entirely fair. She hadn't paid it much attention. She was paying attention now. What does Denton Pierce want with me? She asked. Lyle's smile didn't waver. He opened the leather folder. We're here to follow up on the property transfer agreement, he said, per the contract signed by your late husband, Harold Cross. Dated September 14th, 3 years ago. He held out the document. Ellie took it. She was not a woman who showed much on her face. Harold had always said she had the best poker face of anyone he'd ever played against, man or woman. She had won $17 from him over the course of their marriage, and he had never once seen it coming. So when she read the document, she didn't let them see anything. She read slowly. She read every word. The contract described a sale of Cross Ranch, all 412 acres, the house, the barn, all structures, to Pierce Land Holdings, for a figure that was below market value, but not so far below as to look obviously criminal. The terms were straightforward. The language was professional. And at the bottom, on the signature line marked Harold B. Cross, there was a signature. Ellie stared at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at Raymond Lyle. You said this was signed September 14th, she said. That's correct. 3 years ago. Yes, ma'am. She looked back at the document. Her voice stayed even. Harold was right-handed his whole life. He broke his right wrist in 1994 when a horse threw him. After that, he wrote with his left hand. Every check, every letter, every birthday card he ever signed. Left hand. She turned the document toward Lyle. This signature was written by a right-handed person. The smile on Lyle's face did something complicated. It didn't disappear. It just became something else. Something more careful, Mrs. Cross, he said. The document was notarized by a licensed. I know what a notary stamp looks like, Ellie said. I've signed a few documents in my time. I'm telling you that my husband did not write this signature. Whoever did write it used the wrong hand. Silence. The other men stayed by the trucks. One of them shifted his weight. The other looked out at the pasture like the cattle were suddenly very interesting. Lyle closed his leather folder. You have 30 days, he said. Per the terms of the contract, occupancy transfer is required within 30 days of formal notification. We're notifying you today. He set a second copy of the document on the porch railing. Then he looked at her with something that might have been pity, or might have been warning. She couldn't quite tell which. I'd recommend speaking with an attorney, he said. I'd recommend, Ellie replied, that you tell Denton Pierce what I just told you. Lyle nodded once, got back in the truck. Both vehicles turned around and drove back down the gravel drive. She watched them go. She watched until the dust settled, and the sound of the engines faded, and there was nothing left but the wind and the cattle and the mockingbird. Then she picked up the document from the porch railing. She read it one more time. Harold B. Cross. September 14th. Harold had died in February, 3 years ago. This contract claimed he had signed it the following September, 7 months after. He was in the ground, 7 months. Someone had sat down, studied Harold's signature, copied it with the wrong hand, and dated it to a September morning, when Harold Cross had already been buried for the better part of a year. This was not a mistake. This was not a clerical error. This was a deliberate, calculated act. The kind that required planning and patience, and the belief that a widow alone on a ranch would not look closely enough, or would not know what she was looking at if she did. They had underestimated her on both counts. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding. Someone had forged her dead husband's name on a document designed to steal her land. And they had done it with enough polish, enough legal language, enough notary, stamps and leather folders and polite men in clean shirts to make it look like something you might just accept. She set the document on the kitchen table. She put her hand flat on it. And for just a moment, one single moment, the cold fury of it, the obscenity of it. Someone using Harold's name like that. Harold, who had been the most honest man she'd ever known. Harold, who had never cheated anyone out of anything in 67 years of living. Someone had signed his name to a lie. She breathed in. She breathed out. Then she picked up her truck keys and her jacket, and she went to see Dorothy Mercer. Dorothy Mercer had been making cinnamon rolls since 1978. She had a theory about this, which she would share with anyone who stayed still long enough to hear it. The theory was that people didn't actually come to a bakery for the food. They came because something about warm bread in a warm room made them feel like the world was manageable, like whatever was wrong could at least be sat with for a little while, before you had to go back out and deal with it. She'd built a whole business on that theory, and she wasn't wrong. Mercer's Bakery on Main Street was the kind of place that had a regular crowd by 7 in the morning and a waiting list for the Friday pies. The tables were mismatched, but the coffee was strong, and the cinnamon rolls were enormous, and nobody had ever left hungry. Dot herself was 71 years old, small and solid. With white hair she kept short, and reading glasses she was always losing and then finding on top of her own head. She had been Ellie's closest friend for 35 years. They had met at a church potluck, argued about whose brisket was better, and been inseparable ever since. The bell above the bakery door rang when Ellie came in. It was a little after 9. The morning rush had thinned. 2 older men sat at the window table with their coffees and their newspapers. Woman Ellie didn't recognize was wrapping up a box of muffins at the counter. Dot looked up from behind the register. She saw Ellie's face, and something moved behind Dot's eyes. Something that came and went too fast for a stranger to catch. But Ellie was not a stranger. Ellie had known Dorothy Mercer for 35 years. She had seen that expression before. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for something to arrive. And it had just arrived. Dot finished with the customer. She handed over the muffin box and made change and smiled warmly until the woman left. Then she looked at Ellie. "Come on back," she said. She led Ellie into the small room behind the kitchen, a table, 2 chairs, window that looked out on the alley behind the building. Dot had always used it for her bookkeeping. It smelled like cinnamon and coffee and old paper. Ellie sat down. She set the document on the table between them. Dot looked at it. She didn't pick it up right away. "Pierce Land Holdings sent men to the ranch this morning," Ellie said. 3 of them. "One of them handed me this." Dot was quiet. "It's a contract," Ellie continued, "for the sale of Cross Ranch. It has Harold's name on it. A signature and a date." She paused. "The date is September 14th. 3 years ago." Dot's hands were resting on the table. Ellie watched them. They were the hands of a woman who had spent 50 years baking, flour-worn, capable, steady. But right now, the left one tightened almost imperceptibly. The fingers pressed together. "The signature is wrong," Ellie said. Harold used his left hand. This was written right-handed. Whoever signed it didn't know that about him. A long moment. "Dot," Ellie said quietly. "When I walked in here, you weren't surprised." The silence stretched out between them. Outside, a car passed on Main Street. One of the old men at the window table laughed at something his companion said. Dot took off her reading glasses. She set them on the table. She pressed her fingers to her eyes for a moment. Then she said, "Harold came to see me." Ellie waited. "About 4 weeks before he passed," Dot said. "He drove over one morning, before I even opened. I remember because I was still setting out the chairs. He knocked on the glass. She looked at the table. Not at Ellie. He gave me an envelope. A regular manila envelope, sealed," he said. And he said it very carefully, like he'd practiced the words. He said, "Dorothy, if anything happens to me, you hold on to this." And you give it to Ellie only when she needs it for something bigger than a courtroom. When she needs it for the people of Harlow. You'll know when. The kitchen was very quiet. He didn't tell you what was inside, Ellie said. No, but he told you why. Dot finally looked up. Her eyes were bright, not with tears yet, but with the effort of holding them back. He said Pierce had shown him a piece of paper, she said. A contract. He said Pierce told him to sign it, or things would get difficult for the ranch. For you. She paused. Harold said he refused. He said he'd never sign it. But he said he was afraid Pierce would find another way. Ellie absorbed this. Harold had known. He had seen Pierce coming, and he had tried to protect her in the only way he knew how. Quietly, carefully, the way he did everything. He had left her something. A piece of evidence she didn't even know about, held by the person he trusted most after her. Where's the envelope? Ellie asked. Home. In my closet. Behind the winter coats. All right, Ellie stood. Don't move it. Don't tell anyone about it. Not yet. Dot nodded. Then, Ellie. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. After Harold passed, I kept thinking, maybe it would never come to anything. Maybe Pierce would leave you alone. I kept waiting for the right time, and the time never came. And then 3 years went by, and Ellie's voice was firm but not unkind. You did what Harold asked. You kept it safe. That's what mattered. She picked up the document from the table. Right now, she said. That's enough. Garrett's car was in the driveway when she got home. She hadn't called him. She had sent one text that morning, before the men in the black trucks arrived. Call me when you can. That was all. But Garrett Cross had driven 4 hours from Austin, in the time it had taken her to go to Dot's and come back. He was sitting on the porch steps, 31 years old, dark-haired like Harold, but taller, with her eyes, that particular shade of gray that her own mother had called storm cloud, and Harold had called trouble. He was in jeans and a flannel shirt and his good boots, which meant he'd stopped somewhere along the way to change out of whatever lawyer clothes he'd been wearing. He stood up when she pulled in. She got out of the truck. Mom, he said. You drove fast, she said. You sent me a text that said call me. You never say call me. You usually just say how are things, and then it takes 3 messages to figure out if something's actually wrong. She handed him the document as she walked past him and up the steps. He read it on the porch, while she hung up her jacket and put on a fresh pot of coffee. He came inside, set the document on the kitchen table. She could see him trying to organize his thoughts the way he always did, putting things in order before he spoke. He'd been like that since he was small. Deliberate, precise. Harold had called it the lawyer instinct. Ellie had always thought it was just his way of making sure he meant what he said before he said it. Okay, we said. This is a forgery. Yes, the signature, the date, all of it. Do you have anything of Harold's? Something with his actual signature from the right period. 3 filing cabinets full. Garrett nodded. He sat down. Ellie poured 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of him and sat across the table. We should file a complaint with the county clerk, he said. We document the discrepancy. Get an expert to verify the signature difference. Request a freeze on any title transfer pending investigation. It'll take time, but it's the cleanest approach. If we go through proper channels. Pierce owns the proper channels, Ellie said. Garrett stopped. The county clerk, she said. The title office. The district judge. I don't know for certain how many he's gotten to, but I know enough to know we can't walk this through local courts and expect it to come out the other side looking like what it is. Mom, you can't just assume. 3 ranches to the north of here, she said. The Beaumont property, the old Kessler spread, the Haverford place, all sold to Pierce in the last 2 years. You talked to any of those families? Garrett was quiet. Lorraine Beaumont told me her father didn't want to sell, Ellie said. He was in his 80s. She said men came out, talked to him, came back again and again. And eventually a sale went through and her father couldn't really explain to her what had happened. He said he felt like he'd signed something, but he didn't remember what. And Earl Kessler's son told me the title transfer had paperwork errors he couldn't get anyone at the county office to correct. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. I'm not assuming, Garrett. I'm telling you what I know. Garrett looked at the document. He was quiet for a moment. Then we go above the county level, he said. State Attorney General's office. Or federal. With what? Old woman's word and a signature that the other side's expert will call inconclusive. She shook her head. We need more. We need something solid enough that no one can bury it. And you have a plan for that. It wasn't quite a question. I have a starting point, she said. The rest we figure out as we go. He looked at her across the table. That storm cloud look, the one she recognized because she saw it in her own mirror. You're not going to do this quietly, he said. Are you? Harold tried quiet, she said. Harold tried careful and methodical and working within the system. And Harold's dead and Pierce's men were in my driveway this morning, telling me I have 30 days to leave. The silence between them was heavy. I'm not going anywhere, Ellie said. It was a simple statement, absolutely calm. And I'm not going to spend 30 days trying to convince a system that's been paid to ignore me. Whatever we do it so that everybody sees it. So it can't be buried. Garrett was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the tall grass of the east pasture. The barn door creaked. I'll call someone I know at the state bar, he said finally. Off the record at first. And I'll reach out to a document examiner I worked with in Austin. She's good and she doesn't know Pierce. That's a start, Ellie said. It's a small start. Most starts are. He almost smiled at that. Almost after a moment, he reached across and took the document and began reading it again with different eyes. Not just seeing the fraud in it, but mapping out the architecture of it. The way he had learned, she supposed, to approach problems at that desk in Austin. She watched him work. He looked like Harold when he concentrated. The same small crease between the brows. The same stillness in the shoulders. She loved her son fiercely and quietly, the way she loved most things. She just hoped he was ready for what was coming. He came at the end of the day, which she thought was deliberate. The light was failing. She was closing up the barn. The kind of hour when a woman alone on a ranch would feel the distance from town most acutely. The quiet deepening, the darkness gathering, the long empty road that connected her to everything else. There were 3 trucks this time, and they didn't park politely on the drive. They came through the open gate and rolled right up into the yard, and the men who got out were not wearing slacks. There were 6 of them. The one in front was big, broad across the shoulders, sunburned, with the worn hat pushed back on his head. He moved with the loose confidence of someone who had never been in a situation he couldn't physically dominate. He looked about 38. He looked like trouble that had been looking for a place to happen. Garrett appeared in the kitchen doorway. He saw the men. He came out onto the porch. The big man looked at him. Then back at Ellie. Mrs. Cross, he said. His voice was flat, Texas accented, uninterested in being polite. I'm Vaughn Pickett. I work for Pierce Land Holdings. You received a document today. I did, she said. Then you understand what the situation is. I understand what Mr. Lyle told me this morning. Yes. Vaughn Pickett walked closer. He stopped about 10 feet from her. Behind him, the other 5 men stayed by the trucks, not moving, but present. The way numbers were meant to be present. I'm not here to talk legal paperwork, he said. I'm here to make sure you understand that this isn't something you want to fight. Is that a recommendation or a threat? It's advice. He looked around the property. The barn, the house, the pasture beyond. Nice place. Lot of work for one woman. I manage fine. I'm sure you do. He looked back at her. But things have a way of becoming more difficult when people decide to make them difficult. Equipment breaks down. Fences get cut. Animals get spooked. A pause. You understand what I'm saying? I understand perfectly, Ellie said. She kept her voice completely level. Not because she wasn't angry, she was. But she had been angry before, and she had learned that anger burned cleaner when it burned slow. Garrett stepped down off the porch. Any damage to this property or interference with my mother's livestock constitutes criminal. Nobody's doing anything, Vaughn said pleasantly. He didn't even look at Garrett. We're just having a conversation. Then the conversation is done, Ellie said. Vaughn Pickett looked at her for a moment. Just looked at her. The way people looked at something they had already decided wasn't an obstacle worth taking seriously. 30 days is a courtesy, he said. Pierce is a patient man. Up to a point, he put his hat back on straight. Don't make him impatient. He walked back to the trucks. The men loaded up. They drove out the gate and down the road and were gone. The yard was quiet. Garrett stood beside her. She could feel the tension in him. The effort of not having said more, not having done more. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine, Mom. I'm fine, Garrett." She started toward the house. "Come inside. There's leftover stew." He followed her. At the kitchen table, over stew and bread and coffee, she told him about Dot, about the envelope, about what Harold had done, going to Dot 4 weeks before he died, preparing for a possibility he hoped wouldn't come but knew might. Garrett listened without interrupting. He was good at that. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. He knew, Garrett said, he knew Pierce was dangerous. He knew he might not be able to stop what was coming. So he did what he could. She looked at the tabletop. He always said the point wasn't to win every fight. The point was to make sure the truth didn't disappear. And the envelope is still at Dot's, safe. For now, Garrett nodded slowly. "What was in it?" "I don't know yet. When will you?" "When the time is right." She looked at him. "That's what Harold said. When she needs it for something bigger than a courtroom. When she needs it for the people of Harlow. That's when." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You sound like you already have a plan." "I have the beginning of one." He shook his head slightly. Not in disagreement. More in the particular disbelief that had been his expression since he was 12 years old. And first began to understand that his mother was a different kind of person than most. "You're not scared," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. She thought about it honestly. "I'm scared of losing this place. I'm scared of what it would mean. Not just losing the land, but what it would mean that they won. That they could take Harold's name and put it on a lie. And get away with it." She paused. "That scares me plenty, but not of those men." She looked at her son. "Garrett," she said, "I have been shooting since I was 9 years old. I won my first competition when I was 19. I won my last one at 53. She stood up and picked up bowls. "Vaughn Pickett has never been in the same room as someone like me. He doesn't know that because I don't advertise it. And right now," she set the bowls in the sink and ran the water. "That's exactly where I want it to stay." Garrett sat at the table, looking at the place where the forged document had rested. "What do you need me to do?" he said. "Tomorrow morning, call your contact at the State Bar. Off the record. I want to know if there's anything Pierce connected in the current judicial appointments in this county." She dried her hands. "Find out if your document examiner can look at something without filing anything officially." "Not yet." "And tonight?" "Tonight," she said, "I'm going to do something I should have done a long time ago." She went to the bedroom. She came back with a wooden box. Old, dark-stained, the hinges worn to a soft brown. She set it on the kitchen table. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in a cloth that had been folded with care, was a Colt single-action army revolver. Dark wood grip, steel barrel, the finish worn in the places where a hand had held it 10,000 times. Beside it, a tarnished metal badge. First place, 1987. First place, 1991. A small folded note in handwriting she would have known anywhere. She unfolded it. "For when there's no other way, and you'll know when." She read it twice, then she set it back in the box. She did not take out the gun. She did not close the box either. She just stood there for a moment, with her hand resting on the edge of the wood, in the warm light of the kitchen that Harold had built, in the house that sat on the land that his hands had shaped. And she felt the full weight of all of it. The loss, the love, the outrage, and underneath all of that, something older and quieter, the knowledge that she knew what she was doing, that she had always known. "Harold," she said softly, to the kitchen, to the box, to the particular silence that had lived in this house for 3 years. "I'm going to need a little more time." She closed the box, but she left it on the table. Ellie was up before 5, not because she couldn't sleep. She had slept fine, the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who had made a decision and was at peace with it. She was up because there was work to do, and she had never been the kind of person who waited for daylight to start doing it. She made coffee. Strong. She drank it standing at the kitchen window. The wooden box was still on the table where she'd left it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her jacket, her truck keys, and the copy of the forged document. She left a note for Garrett on the counter. 3 words, "Goin' to work." The thing about living in a small town for 40 years was that you knew things, not gossip, not rumors, something more useful than that. You knew which families had sold and which hadn't. You knew who owed money to whom. You knew which county office had changed personnel in the last 2 years and which hadn't. You knew who had been at the feed store on a Tuesday morning and who hadn't shown up to the harvest potluck for the first time in 20 years. You knew the texture of a place. And when that texture changed, when something that had always been one way was suddenly different, you felt it the way you felt a change in weather. Before the clouds arrived, before the temperature dropped, Ellie had been feeling it for 18 months. She just hadn't known what she was feeling until now. Her first stop was the County Land Records Office. It opened at 8. She was there at 8:02, which was early enough that the woman at the front desk, Janet Pruitt, who had worked there for 11 years and had a daughter who played piano at the Methodist church, was still unlocking her computer. "Ellie Cross," Janet said, looking up. "Haven't seen you in a while." "Morning, Janet. I need to pull records on some recent title transfers. Is that all right?" "Of course." "Which properties?" Ellie set a handwritten list on the counter. 7 properties. The Beaumont Ranch, the Kessler Spread, the Haverford Place, and 4 others she had identified from conversations over the past 18 months. All of them in the northern half of Harlow County. All of them within what she was now beginning to understand as a geographic pattern. A rough circle of land with Cross Ranch at its center. Jeanette looked at the list. Something moved across her face. "Some of these are pretty recent," she said. "I know. That's why I'm interested in them." A pause. "These are all public record." "Yes," Ellie said, "they are." Janet printed the records. It took about 20 minutes. Ellie sat in the plastic chair beside the door and waited without fidgeting. The way she had learned to wait in hunting blinds when she was 11 years old and her father had told her that patience wasn't passive. It was a skill. It was something you practiced until it was as natural as breathing. When the papers came, she thanked Janet and left. She sat in her truck in the parking lot and spread the records across the passenger seat. 7 properties, 7 title transfers, all to Pierceland Holdings or its subsidiaries. She went through them methodically, the way Harold had taught her to read a contract. Look for the dates. Look for the gaps. Look for anything that doesn't match the pattern of how a normal transaction flows. What she found took her breath away. Not dramatically, quietly, the way the truth usually arrived. Not with a crash, but with a cold settling feeling, like ice water spreading through your chest. 5 of the 7 transfers had been notarized by the same person. A notary named Gerald Foss. She didn't know that name. She wrote it down. 4 of the 7 had the same attorney listed on the seller's side. A man named Holt. She wrote that down too. And 3 of the 7, 3 separate families selling 3 separate properties, had signed their documents within the same 10-day window. 10 days in August 2 years ago. 3 families who had presumably made independent decisions to sell land they had farmed for generations, all signing within 10 days of each other. That was not a coincidence. That was a coordinated operation. She folded the papers and put them in her jacket pocket. Her second stop was the Harlow County Public Library. She needed newspaper archives, the Harlow Courier, which had been printing weekly since 1948 and had never, to her knowledge, been owned by anyone connected to Pierce. The librarian, a retired schoolteacher named Frances, who was 8 years old and remembered everything she had ever read, helped her pull issues from the past 3 years. She was looking for something specific: land disputes, contested sales, letters to the editor from ranch families, any coverage of Pierceland Holdings. She found less than she expected, which was itself a finding. A company that had acquired 11 properties in a county in 3 years should have generated more coverage than this. There were 2 brief news items: routine announcements of business permits. 1 mention in a real estate column. That was all. The Harlow Courier's editor had changed 18 months ago. The new editor was a man named Brixton, who had come from a paper 2 counties over. She wrote that down. Her third stop was harder. She drove out to the Beaumont property, or what used to be the Beaumont property. The gate had a new sign on it now: Pierceland Holdings. The house was empty. The barn looked like it hadn't been used in months. The land itself was untouched, just sitting there, waiting for whatever Pierce had planned for it. She parked on the road and sat for a moment. Then she drove another half-mile down to the small house, where Lorraine Beaumont's father, Earl, now lived with his daughter after the sale. She had called ahead from the library parking lot. Lorraine met her at the door. She was 53, solid and practical, with her father's wide-set eyes and the looks of someone carrying more than she showed. She brought Ellie inside, where Earl Beaumont sat in an armchair by the window. He was 84. His mind was still mostly sharp, but he had the look of a man who had lost something he couldn't quite name. "Earl," Ellie said, sitting across from him, "I need to ask you about the sale, about what happened." He looked at his hands. "I don't remember it so good, I know. Take your time." Men came out. Few times. Talked about the land, about how the market was changing. He shook his head slowly. "I didn't want to sell. Lorraine knows I didn't want to sell." "There was paperwork," Lorraine said from the doorway. Her voice was controlled but tight. "A lot of paperwork. Different men bringing different versions of the same documents. Dad got confused about which ones he'd already signed. And then one day, they showed up with something that said it was finalized, and there were 3 notary stamps on it and an attorney we'd never met, and..." She stopped, and the land was gone. Ellie looked at Earl. "Did anyone named Holt represent you?" she asked. "As your attorney?" Earl frowned. "There was a man named Holt. Did you hire him?" "I thought Lorraine hired him." Lorraine looked at Ellie. "I thought Dad hired him." Neither of them had hired him. He had simply appeared, presented himself as representing the seller's interests, signed the documents, and disappeared. Ellie drove back to Harlow with her hands steady on the wheel, and her mind working in the deliberate, unhurried way it worked when she was tracking something, laying out what she knew, identifying what was missing, not rushing to conclusions before the ground was solid. Pierce wasn't just forging signatures. He had built an entire system. Compliant notaries, a phantom attorney, a 10-day window when families were confused and pressured and surrounded by paperwork they didn't understand, presented by men who were trained to seem legitimate. And somewhere inside that system was the mechanism that had taken Cross Ranch from Harold before he was even cold in the ground. She needed 2 more things. She needed what was in Dot's envelope, and she needed to know what Sheriff Wade Dunbar had been doing with his silence for the past 3 years. She called Dot from the truck. "I'm coming over," she said. "Not the bakery. Your house. I'll put coffee on," Dot said. Dorothy Mercer lived 3 blocks off Main Street in a house she had owned since 1981. It was yellow, which Harold had always teased her about. "Nobody paints a house yellow in Texas, Dot." And Dot had always said, "Harold Cross." "That is exactly why I did it." The envelope was on the kitchen table when Ellie arrived. It was a regular manila envelope, sealed with the metal clasp and a strip of tape along the top. Harold's handwriting was on the front, not an address. Just 2 words. For Ellie. Dot poured coffee. She sat across the table. She did not tell Ellie to open it, or wait to open it, or anything at all. She just sat there with her hands around her cup, which was the right thing to do. Ellie broke the tape. She opened the clasp. She reached inside. There were 3 things. The first was a single sheet of paper, a document. She recognized the format immediately because she had spent the morning looking at documents just like it. It was a contract for the sale of Cross Ranch, dated 4.5 years ago, presented to Harold by Pierce Land Holdings, complete with a signature line at the bottom blank. Harold had never signed it, but along the right margin, in Harold's cramped left-handed writing, were 7 lines of notes, dates, names, a description of who had brought the document, what they had said, how they had tried to pressure him. At the bottom of the margin, in letters slightly larger than the rest, "This is the original they brought me. I did not sign. Chidge forged my name on a copy. Witness to my refusal. W. Dunbar, February 3rd. Ellie read it twice. Wade Dunbar. Sheriff Wade Dunbar had been present when Harold refused to sign. Harold had listed him as a witness. She set the first page aside. The second item was a folded piece of lined notebook paper. Harold's handwriting again. A list of names and dates. 9 families in Harlow County, and the dates when Pierce's men had first approached them. Going back 5 years. Harold had been tracking this for 5 years. Quietly, methodically, in the way he did everything, talking to neighbors and writing things down in his careful left-handed script. He had known the scope of it. He had known, and he had been building a record. The third item was the smallest, a note card. 3 sentences. Eleanor, by the time you read this, I hope I'm wrong about everything. But if I'm not, trust Dot. Trust of the people of Harlow. Don't trust the building where the judge sits. The truth belongs outside. She read it 3 times. The kitchen was very quiet. Dot was watching her. Ellie set the note card down. She pressed her fingertips against her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she lowered her hands. Her face was composed. He knew, she said. Not surprised. Just confirming. He knew Pierce was coming for the land, Dot said softly. He couldn't stop it. But he could leave you something to fight with. And Dunbar. Ellie looked at the note again. Witness to my refusal. W. Dunbar. Harold trusted him, Dot said. At least enough for that. Harold was careful about trust. Yes, Dot said. He was? Ellie sat with that for a moment. She thought about Wade Dunbar, 67 years old, sheriff for 19 years. The kind of man who had always been present without being visible. She had never had a strong feeling about him either way. He had been decent at his job. He had shown up at Harold's funeral. He had nodded at her in the feed store a few times since then. He had also said nothing for 3 years. About any of this. She put everything back in the envelope. She folded it once and put it inside her jacket. Dot, she said. You've been carrying this for 3 years, I have. That must have been hard. Dot looked at her coffee. Harold asked me to. And I owed Harold. She paused. You both helped me when Robert died. When the bakery almost didn't survive that year. You were there. She looked up. This was the only thing he ever asked me for in return. Ellie reached across the table and put her hand over Dot's. It's time to use it, she said. I know. Dot straightened. She was small, but she straightened like someone setting down something heavy and squaring their shoulders after. Whatever you need from me. Whatever comes next, I need you to stay quiet about this for a few more days. And I need you to know that when the time comes, when it's the right moment, I'm going to ask you to stand up in front of everyone. Dot looked at her steadily. I'll be there. Ellie nodded. She stood. She picked up her jacket. At the door she stopped. Dot, she said. That photograph in the bakery. The one of the 2 of us from 1989. The one where you're both holding trophies. Harold's second place and mine's first. She almost smiled. Don't take that down. Garrett was at the kitchen table with his laptop and 3 legal pads ads when she got home. He had been working. She could tell by the way his hair looked. The unconscious habit he had of running his hand through it when he was thinking hard. And by the fact that there were 4 empty coffee cups arranged in a line beside the laptop like soldiers. Up when she came in. I found something, he said. So did I, she said. You go first. He turned one of the legal pads toward her. My contact at the state bar, he said. Off the record, like you asked. He ran a quiet check on judicial appointments in Harlow County over the past 4 years. 2 of the 3 district judges have financial connections to Pierce Land Holdings. Not direct, but through subsidiary investments. LLCs that are 2 or 3 layers removed, not impossible to trace, not impossible. But not quick either, he paused. And the county clerk, the one who would process a title dispute. Her brother-in-law works for Pierce's main contracting company. Has for 2 years, so we can't use the local courts. Not safely. Not without tipping Pierce off that we know what we know. He leaned back. My document examiner looked at a scan of the forged signature. She says it's consistent with someone copying a signature from a photograph or photocopy, not tracing directly. Whoever did it was practiced but not professional. She can testify to that. Good. Keep her on standby. Ellie sat down. She put the envelope on the table between them. She told him what was in it. Garrett listened. He didn't interrupt. His expression shifted once when she said Wade Dunbar's name, but he held it together and let her finish. When she was done, he sat for a long moment. Dunbar was there, he said. He witnessed Harold refusing to sign. He has been the county sheriff this whole time. And he hasn't said a word. No, what does that mean? I don't know yet. Could mean he's afraid. Could mean he's compromised. Could mean he's been waiting for the same thing Harold was waiting for. The right moment. She looked at her son. But I'm going to find out. Garrett was quiet. Then he said, There's something else. His voice had changed, just slightly. She had raised this boy. She knew every register of his voice. What? She said. He didn't answer immediately. He closed his laptop. He set down his pen. He looked at the table. "About a month ago," he said. "Before you called me. Before any of this, or what I thought was before any of this." He stopped. Started again. "I got a call from a man who said he represented Pierceland Holdings," he said. "And he was very smooth about it. Very pleasant," he said. He understood. I was Harold Cross's son and sole heir. He said that there was a pending property matter, and that Pierce was prepared to offer a significant sum for the voluntary assignment of inheritance rights. The kitchen was quiet. "He wanted me to sign over my rights to the property," Garrett said, "before you knew anything about the forged contract. Before you'd even received the notification." Ellie looked at her son. "I said no," Garrett said, "immediately. I told him I had no interest and not to call again." He looked up. "But I didn't tell you. Because I don't know what I thought. I thought maybe it was just a business inquiry. I thought if I told you, you'd worry. I told myself it didn't mean anything." He paused. "It meant something," he said. "Yes," Ellie said. "They approached me first because they thought I was the weak point. They thought if they got me, they wouldn't need the forgery, or they wanted both." "Insurance," Garrett nodded. He looked like a man doing the uncomfortable work of seeing himself clearly. "I should have told you," he said. "Yes, you should have." A beat of silence. "But you're telling me now," she said. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. This boy she had raised in this house on this land. This boy who had Harold's frown and her eyes, and his own particular stubbornness that came from both of them combined. "Pierce picked you because he thought you'd be easier than me," she said. "That tells me something about what he thinks of both of us." She reached across and picked up one of the legal pads. "He underestimated both of us. Let's make sure he keeps doing that." Garrett let out a long breath. "What do we do next?" he said. "Tonight," she said. "We go see Sheriff Dunbar." The sheriff's office closed at 6. It was 6:45 when Ellie knocked on the back door. She had called first. She had said 3 words. Harold's envelope weighed. And Dunbar had said, after a silence that lasted several seconds, "Come to the back." He was alone. The office was dim, just the desk lamp on, the overhead fluorescence off. He looked older than she remembered from the last time she'd really looked at him. His hair had gone mostly white. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He looked, she thought, like a man who hadn't been sleeping well. She understood why now. She set Harold's notes on his desk. She pointed to the line at the bottom. "Witness to my refusal, W. Dunbar. February 3rd. Dunbar looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he got up and went to the metal cabinet against the wall. He unlocked it with a key from his belt. He reached inside and pulled out a manila folder, worn at the edges from being handled and rehandled. He set it on the desk. "I've been carrying this for 3 years," he said. "Since before Harold died." He sat back down. He did not touch the folder again, just looked at it. "Harold came to me. You know that now from the note. He came to me in February, 2 months before he passed. He brought me the original contract Pierce had pressured him to sign. He told me what Pierce was doing, not just with his land, but with the others. He'd been tracking it, I know," Ellie said. "He asked me to be a witness to his refusal. He hoped, that if something happened to him, having a law enforcement witness might matter." Dunbar's jaw tightened. He wasn't wrong about something happening. "What's in the folder?" Garrett asked. Dunbar looked at him. Then back at Ellie. "Everything Harold brought me, and everything I've added to it since. Documentation of the title transfers. Records of the complaints I received. Informal complaints. People coming in and saying something felt wrong about their sale. And what happened to those complaints?" "Which was?" Ellie said. "They disappeared," he said it flat. "No drama. I filed them through proper channels. The county system. 3 of them went to the district court as potential civil matters. All 3 were dismissed within 60 days for procedural reasons. One of my deputies, a good man 20 years on the job, started asking questions about the Haverford sale. He was transferred to a desk position and eventually resigned." "Silence, and you," Ellie said. Dunbar looked at her directly. "I got a visit. From a man who worked for Pierce, not Lyle, a different one. He told me, very politely, that there was a history of financial irregularities in my office from 8 years ago, before my time. But the records," he said, had my name adjacent to some of the paperwork in a way that could look unfortunate. Was it true? No. But didn't need to be true, it just needed to be investigated. An investigation would have ended my career, true or not. He paused. I have 7 months until I retire. I have a daughter in her last year of college. I made a choice. The office was very quiet. A wrong choice, he said, without self-pity, just stating it. Yes, Ellie said, I know. He pushed the folder across the desk toward her. This is everything. 19 months of documentation. I kept adding to it even when I told myself I wasn't going to do anything with it. I kept adding to it because I couldn't stop. She picked up the folder. She opened it. It was thorough, more thorough than she had expected. Dunbar had been careful and precise. Dates, times, names, descriptions of conversations, copies of documents. The kind of record that a 19-year law enforcement veteran assembled without thinking about it, out of professional habit, even when he was trying not to. Harold had chosen his witness well. Can you testify to this? She said. Dunbar was quiet. I know what I'm asking, she said. I know what it costs. It costs me the retirement I planned, he said. Maybe more. He paused. But I look at that note of Harold's every time I open that cabinet. Witness to my refusal. He trusted me with that. And I've been sitting on it for 3 years. He looked at Ellie. You ask me to testify. I'll testify, he said. But I want to do it right. Not in a county courtroom that Pierce can reach. I want this to go somewhere it can't disappear. It won't go to a county courtroom, Ellie said. Where then? She folded the folder carefully and set it beside Harold's envelope. In front of Harlow, she said. Every person in this county who's had something taken from them, or watched someone else have something taken, or just wanted to understand why their neighbors were gone and their lands sat empty. She looked at him steadily. That's where this goes, and no one can reach that. Dunbar looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, slowly, the way a man nodded when he had been waiting for permission to do the right thing, and had finally received it. They were back at the kitchen table by 9. Ellie, Garrett, and a phone call with Dot. Dot's voice through the speaker, small and clear from her yellow house 3 blocks off Main Street. The wooden box was still on the table. Ellie moved it to the side to make room for the papers. They laid everything out. Harold's original document with the margin notes, the list of 9 families, the notacard, Dunbar's folder with 19 months of documentation, Garrett's legal pads with the judicial connections, and the document examiner's preliminary findings. The 7 title records from the county office, the notes from Ellie's conversation with Earl Beaumont and his daughter. It covered most of the table. It was more than she had expected to have. It was still not enough for a court of law. Not a local one, not without risk of suppression. A state-level case would take time she didn't have. Federal involvement would take longer. But Harold's notacard sat at the top of the pile. The truth belongs outside. We need to bring this to the people, she said. Not file it, not submit it. Bring it directly to Harlow County and let them see it. The community meeting, Dot said through the phone. Something bigger than a meeting. Something public enough that it can't be quietly managed. She looked at Garrett. How many of those 9 families Harold tracked? How many of them are still in the county? Garrett checked the list. 7 of the 9. I know most of them, Ellie said. Or I knew their people. If they see what Harold put together, if they understand they weren't alone in this, that this was deliberate and systematic, they might be willing to stand up. That's a big ask, Garrett said. People will stand up for the truth, Dot said through the phone, with the certainty of someone who had been making cinnamon rolls for 50 years and knew what made people feel like the world was manageable. When they can see it clearly and they know they're not standing alone, Pierce will know something is happening, Garrett said. If we start talking to people, he'll hear about it. He'll hear about it anyway, Ellie said. He's been hearing about everything. That's fine. Let him hear. She paused. What he won't know is what we have. He doesn't know about Harold's notes. He doesn't know about Dunbar. He's been operating on the assumption that everything Harold put together disappeared when Harold did. She straightened the papers into a neat stack. We need about a week, she said. Maybe 10 days. I need to talk to the families personally, one at a time, quietly. Garrett, I need you to reach your contact at the state bar again, on the record this time. and start building the framework for a state-level complaint that we can file simultaneously with whatever happens publicly. I'll put word out about a gathering, said. Nothing specific, just that there's something the community needs to hear. People will come. They trust the bakery. They trust you, Ellie said. Through the phone, she could hear Dot's smile. Then Pierce moved. The next morning, before Ellie had finished her first cup of coffee, she got a call from Janet Pruitt at the County Land Records office. Janet's voice was careful, the way voices got when a person was saying something they weren't supposed to be saying. I just wanted you to know, Janet said. Someone from Pierce Land Holdings called this morning. They requested the access log for the records you looked at yesterday. Ellie set down her cup. They want to know what I pulled. I'm required to provide it if they file a formal request, which they did. An hour ago. A pause. I thought you should know. As a courtesy. Thank you, Janet. She hung up. Pierce knew she had been to the records office. He knew she had been looking at the other title transfers. He knew she was building a picture. And then, 2 hours later, Garrett's phone rang. He took the call in the hallway. She could hear his voice, low, controlled, professional. When he came back, his face was composed in the particular way that meant he was making an effort. State Bar, he said. My contact got a call this morning from an attorney representing Pierce Land Holdings, raising questions about a conflict of interest on my part in relation to potential litigation. He set his phone on the table. They're trying to get me disqualified from representing you, can they? It's thin, probably won't hold. But it creates a delay and a distraction. Then Dunbar called. The County Board of Supervisors had received an anonymous complaint about financial irregularities in the Sheriff's Department. An internal review was being opened. Dunbar was not suspended. Not yet. But he was on notice. In one morning, Pierce had moved against all three of them. The disqualification attempt against Garrett. The pressure on Dunbar. The records request meant to signal to Ellie that he was watching, not attacking directly. Not yet. Just applying pressure, tightening the space around them. Ellie stood at the kitchen window. Outside, the east pasture was golden in the morning light. The cattle moved slow and easy. The barn sat solid and red against the pale sky. She thought about what it took to love something this much. She thought about Harold, who had known this was coming, and had spent his last months quietly building a record, because he believed that the truth, properly preserved, was stronger than any system built to suppress it, who had trusted Dot and trusted Dunbar, and she understood now, had trusted her most of all, had left her the tools and the evidence in 3 words, you'll know when. She turned from the window. Garrett and Dot. Dot still on the phone, listening, were both looking at her. He moved fast, Garrett said. That means he's worried. He's not worried, Ellie said. He's cautious. There's a difference. Worried people makes mistakes. Cautious people try to close every exit. She picked up her coffee. We're not going to use any of the exits he knows about. She looked at Garrett. Call your examiner. I want a full written report, not preliminary. And call your State Bar contact back. On the record, file the framework complaint today. Don't wait. She looked at the phone. Dot, start making calls. Not about the gathering yet. Just reaching out to the families on Harold's list. Personal calls. Tell them an old friend of Harold's wants to come. Visit. I know most of their mothers, Dot said. I know you do. That's why I'm asking you. She picked up the wooden box from the side of the table. She set it in the center. She opened it. The colt sat in its cloth wrapping, dark and quiet. She picked it up, not dramatically. Just the way you picked up something familiar. Something that had been yours for a long time. She checked the cylinder. Out of old habit. The way her father had taught her, always know what's in it and what isn't. Then she wrapped it back in the cloth and set it in the box. Pierce is going to push harder, she said. Before this is done, he's going to do something that makes everything feel impossible. She closed the box but did not latch it. When that happens, I need both of you to remember something. What? Garrett said. Harold didn't give up. He was a 64-year-old rancher with a bad left wrist and more enemies than he knew. And he spent the last 2 years of his life quietly building a case because he believed it was worth doing. She looked at her son, then at the phone where Dot's breathing was quiet and steady. He believed the truth was worth protecting even when the cost was everything. That's what we're carrying. Not just his land, his belief. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a mockingbird started up in the cedar tree beside the barn. "Okay," Garrett said. "Okay," said Ellie picked up her jacket. There were 7 families to visit before the week was out. She had work to do. Ellie didn't rush it. Rushing would have been wrong. These were people who had been through something. Some of them had lost land that had been in their families for 3 generations. Some of them still didn't fully understand what had happened to them. Some of them had signed papers in a fog of confusion and pressure, and afterward felt a shame they couldn't quite name. The shame of feeling like they should have been stronger, should have seen it coming, should have held on. That shame was part of Pierce's design. Ellie understood that now. The confusion, the paperwork, the phantom attorney, the coordinated 10-day window. It wasn't just efficient. It was engineered to make people feel responsible for their own loss, to make them too embarrassed to talk about it, to isolate them from each other so they never compared notes and realized they were not alone. She went to them one at a time. She sat in their kitchens and their living rooms and their small rental houses in Harlow and the next town over. She drank their coffee, and she listened before she talked. She let them tell her what had happened in their own words and their own time. She did not rush them or summarize for them or tell them what they felt. And then she told them about Harold. She told them that her husband had known what was happening, that he had been tracking it for 2 years before he died, that he had written down their names, their families' names, in his careful left-handed writing because he wanted there to be a record, because he believed they deserved to have someone bear witness to what was done to them. Most of them cried, not all of them, but most. Loretta Haverford, 68 years old, who had sold the property her parents had homesteaded in 1951, sat across from Ellie in the apartment she now rented in town and held Harold's list in both hands and looked at her own family's name, written there in his handwriting, and said, very quietly, he knew, Ellie said, and he wrote it down. He wrote it down. Loretta set the paper on the table. She straightened her back. What do you need from me? That was how most of them ended. Not all at once and not without fear. Several of them were afraid, and they said so plainly, and Ellie did not tell them their fear was wrong. Their fear was reasonable. Pierce was real, and his reach was real, and what he had done to them had been real. But she told them what Harold's notacard said. The truth belongs outside. She told them that the plan was not a lawsuit, not a county court filing that could be dismissed in 60 days. The plan was to bring the truth into the open, in public, before the whole community, in a way that no filing cabinet or procedural dismissal could reach. She told them that when the time came, she would ask them to stand up. Not all 7 agreed immediately. 2 of them needed more time, and she gave it to them without pressure. By Thursday, 5 had said yes. By Friday evening, a 6th called her back. 7 families, 6 willing to stand. That was enough. Garrett was building the state-level complaint in parallel. A formal submission to the Texas Attorney General's office, with copies to the State Bar and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. It wouldn't move fast. These things never did, but it created a paper trail that existed independently of anything Pierce could suppress locally. Record in a place he couldn't reach, Dot had been making calls, not about the gathering specifically, just reaching out. Old friends, church acquaintances, people who knew people. The bakery had been busier than usual all week, which Dot said was probably a coincidence, and Ellie said was probably not. Dunbar was managing the internal review quietly. His 19-year record was clean and the complaint was thin, and the state board assigned to oversee local sheriff's offices had been notified by Garrett, through his state bar contact, of the timing and circumstances of the complaint. It wasn't protection exactly, but it was visibility. And visibility made it harder to do certain things. Pierce's men drove past Cross Ranch twice on Tuesday, once on Thursday. They didn't stop. They didn't need to. The message was the message. We're watching. Ellie watched back. On Friday night, she sat on the porch after dark and looked out at the property and thought about Harold. Not sadly, just clearly. She thought about who he had been, The particular combination of stubbornness and patience and fundamental decencies that had made him the person she had loved for 40 years. He had not been a dramatic man. He had not made speeches. He had just kept doing the right thing, quietly and consistently, for as long as he was able. And when he understood he might not be able to keep doing it much longer, he had made sure the right thing could be done without him. She thought about the people she had sat with this week. 6 families. The shame they had carried. The isolation. The way some of them had not spoken to their neighbors about what happened because they thought their neighbors couldn't possibly understand. Pierce had counted on that. He had built his operation on the assumption that people, when pressed, would retreat into themselves, would absorb the loss quietly, would choose the safety of silence over the risk of speaking. He had built that assumption into everything he did. He had never met Eleanor Cross. She went inside. She checked the wooden box on the kitchen table. She went to bed. Saturday morning came clear and cool. The notice had gone up Wednesday. Dot had posted it in the bakery window and on the community board outside the post office, and sent it through the informal network of phone calls and church bulletins and neighbor-to-neighbor conversations that moved information through a small town faster and more reliably than any newspaper. Community gathering, Saturday 10 a.m. Town Square. Important matters concerning Harlow County land and property rights. All residents welcome. No mention of Pierce. No mention of Cross Ranch, just come by 9:30. The square was already filling. Harlow's town square was a modest thing, a rectangle of grass with a flagpole at the center, an old stone courthouse on one side, the post office and 2 storefronts on the others. There were wooden benches along the perimeter. In summer, it hosted the county fair and the 4th of July celebration. In ordinary times, it was where people parked and walked to lunch and stopped to talk. This was not ordinary times. People came because Dot had asked them to, or because their neighbor had mentioned it, or because they had heard something was happening. And in a small town, something happening was enough. Farmers and shopkeepers, retired couples, people who had sold their land and people who hadn't, people who knew the Cross name and people who had only recently moved to the county. Ellie's truck was already there when most of them arrived. She was standing near the flagpole, talking to Dunbar. He was in full uniform. The first time in recent memory people would say later that he had shown up to something like this with his badge and his hat and the full weight of what he was. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was standing inside it. Garrett stood to her left with a leather folder and his phone. Dot was moving through the crowd with the natural ease of someone who had spent 50 years making people feel welcome. The 6 families were positioned around the square, not together, scattered, natural, as if they had simply arrived and found places to stand. Loretta Haverford near the post office, the Kessler son by the courthouse steps, the others placed where Ellie had quietly suggested, each of them holding their own memories and their own documents and their own version of what Pierce had taken from them. It was 9:55 when the black trucks arrived, 3 of them. Parking on the street at the edge of the square, Pierce Land Holdings had heard about the gathering. Of course they had. Pierce's reach in Harlow was long. Ellie had expected this, had counted on it in a way. Pierce himself stepped out of the second truck. She had not seen him in person before. He was exactly what she had imagined, which was itself a kind of information. 58 years old, silver-haired, built like a man who had once been athletic, and expressed the same confidence through expensive clothes and deliberate posture. He moved through the edge of the gathering with the ease of a man, accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. He surveyed the square. His eyes found Ellie at the flagpole. He smiled. Just briefly, the smile of a man who had been watching this come together and had already decided how it would end. Raymond Lyle was with him, and 4 other men, and Vaughn Pickett. Ellie had planned to speak first. She didn't get the chance. Vaughn Pickett moved before she could open her mouth. He walked from the edge of the square to the center, with the rolling confidence of someone who had never been in a situation he couldn't physically dominate. He stopped about 15 feet from Ellie. He was wearing his hat, his boots, his worn jacket. He looked around at the gathered crowd with an expression that was half contempt and half performance. "Mrs. Cross," he said. Loud, meant to carry. "I heard you had something to say." "I do," she said. "Well," he spread his hands. "So do I." He looked at the crowd. "I've been patient. Mr. Pierce has been patient. 30 days was offered. 30 days is almost up." He looked back at Ellie. "You've been going around talking to people, stirring things up, and that's your right, I suppose. But it seems to me that what we've got here is a legal matter, and legal matters get settled through proper channels." "I agree," Ellie said. "Which is why I'm standing here." He tilted his head. Not quite a smile. "Property dispute isn't a community matter." 11 properties in 3 years, she said clearly. 7 families in this county. "I'd say that makes it a community matter," murmuring through the crowd. Vaughn's jaw tightened slightly. Then he recovered. He looked at the crowd and he did something she hadn't quite expected. He laughed. Low and dismissive, the kind of laugh designed to make someone seem foolish. "You know what I think?" he said. "I think this is a woman who doesn't want to accept a legal outcome. I think she wants to make a scene. And I think—" He looked at her with the expression she had seen on his face in her yard. The appraisal of someone who had already decided she wasn't an obstacle worth respecting. "I think we should settle this simply." He reached into his jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it up. "New offer," he said. "Right now, in front of everyone. Fair market value. I mean actual fair market value, not what was in the original contract. Sign this today and walk away whole." He held it toward her. "Or don't sign it. And we go back to what the court's already decided." Square was very quiet. Ellie looked at the paper. She did not move toward it. "No court in this county has decided anything," she said. "They will." A pause. "Soon." She looked at him steadily. "What are you actually offering, Vaughn?" The use of his first name shifted something in the air. He hadn't expected it. "I just told you." "You offered money," she said. "I'm asking what you're offering." She paused. "Because from where I stand, what Pierce is offering is for me to take a check and walk away from the land Harold and I built for 40 years. Walk away from the truth about how Harold died. Walk away from what happened to the Haverford family and the Kessler family, and 5 others I could name." She looked at the crowd. "Is that the offer?" Silence. Vaughn put the paper back in his jacket. His expression had changed. The performance was dropping, layer by layer, and underneath it was something more complicated. A man who was tired and cornered and not entirely sure why he was still doing what he was doing. "You want to do this the hard way," he said. "I want to do this the honest way." He looked at her, a long look. And then he said something she was not expecting. "Fine." His voice dropped. Less performance now. Something more direct underneath it. "You want to settle this in front of everyone? Then let's settle it. You and me. Right here." He nodded toward the open end of the square where someone had, days ago at Ellie's quiet request, set up 2 wooden target stands 30 yards apart. 1 shot each. You hit yours and I miss mine. You get your hearing in a real court. And Pierce backs off pending outcome. A pause. "I hit mine and you miss. You sign the paper." The crowd stirred. This was the part Pierce had planned. She understood. Not the settlement offer. That was just the opening. This was the actual move. Make it a spectacle. Make it about skill and nerve. Make Eleanor Cross look like a stubborn old woman who had forced a confrontation and lost. Pierce had sent Vaughn Pickett because Pierce thought Vaughn Pickett was the best shot he had. He did not know what he was sending Vaughn into. Ellie looked at the target stands, 30 yards. Standard distance. The targets were 8-inch steel plates. She looked at Vaughn. "One condition," she said. "What?" "After the shooting. Whatever happens, you hear what I have to say. All of it. And so does everyone here." Vaughn glanced back at Pierce. Pierce gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He was confident. "Of course he was, deal," Vaughn said. Someone produced 2 revolvers. Standard weapons. Ellie had brought her own. She held up the Colt. A murmur moved through the crowd. People who were old enough recognized it, or recognized what it meant that she had it. A working revolver, well maintained, carried by someone who knew what they were doing with it. Vaughn looked at it. For the first time, something shifted in his face. Not fear. Something closer to recalibration. They stood side by side at the firing line. A chalk mark someone had drawn on the pavement. 30 yards to the targets. The square had gone completely quiet. The kind of quiet that a crowd produced when it collectively stopped breathing. Vaughn went first. He was good. She could see that immediately, the way he settled his weight, the way he raised the weapon. He was practiced and calm, and he had done this before many times. He fired. The shot hit the outer edge of the plate. A hit, but barely. The crowd exhaled. Vaughn stepped back. He looked at Ellie with something new in his eyes. He had expected to be comfortable right now, and he wasn't. Ellie stepped to the line. She did not rush. She had been doing this since she was 9 years old. She had won her first competition at 19. She had won her last one at 53. In the years since, she had not competed, but she had not stopped. Every week, out behind the barn, she had practiced, quietly, alone, because Harold had said it once and she had never forgotten it. A skill maintained as a choice kept open. She raised the Colt. Her breathing slowed. Everything slowed. The crowd, the square, Pierce's expression, the wind, all of it receded to the periphery. There was only the target and the distance, and the calculation her hands had been making for 55 years. She fired, dead center. The sound of the plate ringing carried across the square like a bell. The crowd erupted. Not everyone, but enough. Voices, applause. Someone toward the back, letting out a sound that was half shout and half laugh. A release of tension that had been building for longer than just this morning. Ellie lowered the Colt. She looked at Vaughn. His face had gone through several things in rapid succession. Surprise, first, then something slower, a reassessment. He was looking at her the way a person looked at something they had fundamentally misunderstood. She saw it happen. The moment he understood who he had been working against, from the edge of the square, Pierce began to clap. Slow, deliberate. The applause of a man who had already decided this was theater. Impressive, he said, moving forward through the crowd. His voice was smooth, unhurried, genuinely impressive. I didn't know you had that in you, Mrs. Cross. He stopped near the firing line. He looked at the crowd, not at Ellie. At the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, you've just watched a shooting demonstration, a skilled one. I'll give her that. He spread his hands. But I want to be very clear about something. He reached into his jacket. He produced a document, thick, bound, official-looking. This morning, at 7:45 a.m., the Harlow County District Court issued an emergency injunction confirming the validity of the Cross Ranch title transfer. He held it up, signed by Judge Alderman. Effective immediately, he looked at Ellie. Whatever Mrs. Cross shoots today, the land is no longer hers, legally, on paper. With a judge's signature, the square went very quiet. Not the held breath quiet of before the shooting, something heavier. The quiet of people realizing that skill and courage and truth were not always enough. That sometimes the system was the weapon. Ellie looked at the document in his hand. She did not reach for it. She did not flinch, but she felt it. The particular cold of understanding that Pierce had never intended this gathering to go any other way. He had let it happen. He had watched the shootout. He had let her win it because he already had the injunction in his pocket. He had filed for it the night before, through a judge he controlled, at an hour when no one was watching. He had let her have the moment. Because the moment didn't matter. Garrett's face had gone careful, lawyer careful, the way it went when he was processing. Something bad. Dot's hand had found Ellie's arm. The crowd was murmuring now, uncertain, some of them starting to drift. This was the moment Pierce had designed. The moment where the woman who had just won sat down instead. Ellie stood still for a long count of 3. Then she said clearly, so the whole square could hear, "Are you finished?" Pierce looked at her. "Because I haven't said what I came here to say yet." She turned to face the crowd. "And we had a deal." This was the first time they had stood face to face. She looked at him without anger, and without fear, and with complete clarity. "Your name was on documents presented to Harold Cross 4.5 years ago," she said loudly enough for the square to hear. Harold refused to sign. He documented his refusal. He asked Sheriff Dunbar to witness it. And then Harold died in what was ruled an accident. And then, 6 months later, a contract appeared bearing Harold's forged signature, dated after his death. Pierce's expression was still composed. But the clapping had stopped. "I have Harold's original documentation of his refusal," she said. I have his notes naming every family in this county that Pierce Land Holdings approached through coercion and misrepresentation. I have Sheriff Dunbar's 19 months of records showing what happened to every complaint that was properly filed through local channels. She nodded to Garrett. Garrett opened his laptop. The screen faced the crowd. He had connected it to a small portable speaker. And for the next 4 minutes, the square was quiet as Harold Cross's voice came through. Recorded in Harold's own handwriting, read aloud by Garrett in a clear, steady voice, describing in Harold's precise and unhurried way what Pierce had done, what he had tried to do, and what Harold had refused. Harold's voice was not there, but Harold's words were. And in a small town where Harold Cross had been known for 40 years, that was close enough. Ellie watched the crowd as Garrett read. She watched the Kessler son, who stood very still with his hands in his pockets. She watched Loretta Haverford, who had her eyes closed. She watched a man she didn't recognize, maybe 40, recently moved to the county, who was recording on his phone with the focused attention of someone who understood what he was witnessing. She watched Pierce. Pierce was listening, still composed, still calculating. His lawyer, Lyle, was beside him now, speaking quietly into his ear. When Garrett finished, the square was silent for a moment. Then Dunbar stepped forward. He was in full uniform. He stood where the whole square could see him. "My name is Wade Dunbar," he said. "I have been the sheriff of Harlow County for 19 years. I am going to read a statement." He unfolded a piece of paper, and he read. He read what Harold Cross had told him. He read what he had witnessed. He read the record of 19 months of documentation. The complaints filed and suppressed. The deputy forced out. The intimidation that had been applied to him personally. He read it in the flat, precise voice of a law enforcement officer reading from a report, which was exactly what it was. He read the line near the end that he had added himself, in his own handwriting, the night before. "I failed in my duty to the people of Harlow County by allowing this evidence to remain unreported for 3 years. I am correcting that failure today. The complete record has been submitted to the Texas Attorney General's Office, the State Bar Association, and the FBI Financial Crimes Division. Copies have been retained by independent parties outside Harlow County." He folded the paper. He looked at Pierce, Denton Pierce. Dunbar's voice carried the particular flatness of a man who had been rehearsing this moment for 3 years, and was finally saying the words out loud. "I am placing you under arrest. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy, coercion." He reached for the handcuffs on his belt, the same onesies he had carried for 19 years. "State authorities have been notified and are en route. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." He paused. "I'd recommend silence," he said. "In my experience, men like you talk too much when they're cornered." Pierce didn't run. She hadn't expected him to. Men like Pierce didn't run. Running was for people who had no other options, and Pierce had spent 20 years ensuring he always had other options. He looked at Lyle. Lyle was already on the phone. He looked at the crowd. He made one more calculation, the practiced assessment of damage and containment, and then Dot stepped forward. Small and white-haired and 71 years old, holding a manila envelope that she had carried from her yellow house 3 blocks off Main Street. "My name is Dorothy Mercer," she said. Her voice was steady, steadier than Ellie had expected, and she had expected it to be steady. "Harold Cross gave me this envelope 4 weeks before he died. He asked me to give it to his wife when the time came." She held it up. The time came, she handed it to Ellie. Ellie did not open it. She had already opened it. Everyone who needed to know what was inside already knew. But she held it up so the square could see it. "Harold Cross spent the last 2 years of his life documenting what was being done to this county," she said. "He didn't do it for himself. He had already refused to sign Pierce's contract. He was never going to sign. He did it for every family that came after him. He believed the truth, properly kept, was stronger than any system built to hide it." She looked at the crowd. He was right. Then she looked at Pierce. "You used Harold's name on a document he never signed," she said. "You used it because you thought he couldn't stop you anymore." She paused. "He stopped you anyway." Pierce looked at her. His composure was still mostly intact, but in his eyes, just for a moment, she saw the thing underneath it. Not fear exactly. Something colder. The recognition of a man who had built his entire operation on a single assumption, that people, when pressed, would give up, and was now understanding that the assumption was wrong. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. State police arrived 41 minutes later. The legal process took time. These things always did. The Texas Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation in November. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division opened a parallel inquiry in December. The judicial connections Garrett had documented were referred to the State Judiciary Commission. The notary Gerald Foss and the phantom attorney Holt were both identified, located, and faced their own proceedings. Pierce was charged in February. 17 counts, including fraud, forgery, coercion, and conspiracy. Lyle, who had done the legal work, negotiated a cooperation agreement. Wade Dunbar's complete documentation was central to the case. It was thorough and precise, and 19 months of it held up completely under scrutiny. The forged signature on Harold's contract was ruled invalid by the state court in March. Cross Ranch remained exactly where it had always been. 6 of the 7 families whose land had been taken filed civil suits. 3 of them resulted in settlements before trial. 2 went to verdict. 1 was still pending. The outcomes were not perfect. They never were. Some of the land was already developed, already altered. Some losses couldn't be fully undone. But the record was there now, outside where it belonged. The Harlow Courier ran the story. The new editor, as it turned out, had only been installed after the previous one retired genuinely, and he was not Pierce's man at all. He ran 5 issues on the case over 4 months, and the story was picked up by 2 state papers and 1 national outlet that covered rural land rights issues. Garrett's disqualification complaint was dismissed in 3 weeks. He opened a small law office in Harlow in January. He said it was temporary. He was still there in April. Dunbar retired in March as planned. His retirement party was at Dot's Bakery. It ran 3 hours longer than expected, because people kept arriving. He shook Ellie's hand at the end of the night, and she held it in both of hers for a moment, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing left to say, and Von Pickett. He did not leave Harlow immediately after the square. He stayed for a week, which surprised her. On the 3rd day, he appeared at the gate of Cross Ranch in the morning, without his hat, and she let him in. They sat on the porch. He told her the full version of what Garrett had partially heard. His father's ranch, lost to Pierce 10 years ago. The debt that Pierce had cleared in exchange for Vaughn's services. The way he had told himself it was just work, just pragmatic, just the way things were. And the way that telling himself that had cost him something he couldn't quite name until he stood in the town square and heard Harold Cross's words read aloud. "I knew the Kessler family," he said, "before. When I was a kid, my father and old man Kessler used to trade equipment in the spring." He looked at the east pasture. "I didn't let myself think about that." Ellie listened. "I didn't know about your husband," he said. "I want you to know that. What happened to him?" "I didn't know." "I believe you," she said. He looked at her. "Why?" "Because Harold's list had your father's family on it," she said. He knew what Pierce had done to them. He would have known what it meant about anyone who ended up working for Pierce after that. Vaughn was quiet. "Your father's property is part of the civil case," she said. "Nothing's certain, but it's part of the record." He nodded slowly. "What will you do?" she said. He thought about it. "I don't know yet." He stood. "Something different." She walked him to the gate. Before he left, he stopped and looked back at the ranch. The red barn, the east pasture, the house with the porch where Harold had sat every morning with his coffee. "It's a good piece of land," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He drove away. She stood at the gate for a moment. Then she walked back up the drive. Spring came to Harlow County the way it always did, quietly at first, and then all at once. The grass came back to the east pasture. The mare had a foal in April, small and uncertain on its legs, which Harold would have loved. The cedar tree beside the barn put out new growth, and the mockingbird, that had been a constant presence since October, established what seemed to be a permanent residence in its branches. On a Saturday morning in April, Ellie and Garrett fixed the fence, not because it needed fixing. She had fixed it herself back in October before any of this began. But the winter had been hard, and 2 posts on the south side had shifted. and it was the kind of work that needed two people. And the right morning. They worked the way she and Harold had worked, without a lot of talking, each understanding what the other needed before it was said. She had raised this boy on this land, and the land was in him the way it was in her, even if he didn't always know it. Dot came over at noon with a basket, sandwiches and pie and coffee in a thermos. She spread a blanket on the grass, and the three of them sat and ate and looked at the east pasture and didn't say much, because there was a particular kind of contentment that was best experienced without narrating it. The azaleas are coming up, Dot said. Harold planted those, Ellie said. 1996. I told him azaleas weren't practical. He said not everything had to be practical. He was right about that, Dot said. He was right about a lot of things. Garrett was lying back on the blanket, looking at the sky. He had his father's frown, and her eyes and his own particular way of being still when he was thinking. Not tense, just present, Mom. He said, the envelope. He paused. Harold's notacard. The truth belongs outside. A pause. How did he know? How did he know that that was the way? She thought about it. She thought about Harold Cross. 64 years old, bad left wrist, 2 years of quiet record-keeping. An envelope left with a woman he trusted. A note left for a wife he believed in. He knew people, she said. He knew that people, when they could see the truth clearly, when it was right in front of them, and they weren't alone in seeing it, they would do the right thing. Most of them, she looked at the pasture. He believed that, stubbornly, even when it cost him. He was right, Garrett said. He usually was. She picked up her coffee. Don't tell him I said that. He was insufferable when he was right. Garrett laughed. It was Harold's laugh, starting slow, involving his whole body. She let herself smile. After lunch, Garrett went inside to take a call. Dot gathered up the basket, moving slowly, the way she always did now. Before she left, she stopped beside Ellie. He'd be proud of you, she said. He'd say I took too long, Ellie said. He'd say both things. Ellie looked at the fence line. At the posts she'd set in October, and the ones she and Garrett had fixed this morning, and the wire running between them, straight and taut, the way a promise was supposed to be kept. Dot, she said, thank you for keeping it. All that time, Dot put her hand on Ellie's arm. He asked me to, I know, but you did it anyway. For 3 years you did it. Dot nodded. She didn't say anything else. She picked up her basket and walked back down the drive. Ellie stood alone in the afternoon light. The east pasture was gold and green, the way it got in spring when the grass was coming back. The barn sat solid and red against the April sky. The mockingbird in the cedar tree was doing what mockingbirds did, cycling through every song it knew, one after another, restless and inventive, and completely unbothered by the fact that nobody had asked it to. She went inside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. The wooden box was on the counter where she had moved it after October, not on the table, not put away, just there, present. She opened it. The colt lay in its cloth wrapping. She looked at it for a moment. Then she wrapped it back up carefully, the way she always did. She closed the box. She carried it to the bedroom and set it in the closet on the high shelf, where it had lived for most of her married life. She didn't lock the closet, but she didn't need to open it either. Not today. She went back to the kitchen. She made coffee. She stood at the window and looked at the fence line, at the work she and Garrett had done this morning, the posts set right and the wire strung clean. Harold had always said a fence was a promise. She had kept his. The coffee finished brewing. She poured a cup. Outside, the mockingbird was still going, moving from one song to the next without pause, without hesitation, as if it had all the time in the world and every song worth singing. She listened to it for a while. Then she went back out to finish the work.